Hi guys, and welcome back. In the previous video, we explored some of the fundamental concepts behind InfluxDB like buckets and field sets and things like that. However, we are now ready to go ahead and actually spin up InfluxDB and take a look at how to start using the actual product. So for starters, if we switch over to our desktop here and open up a web browser like Firefox and head over to the company's homepage, influxdata.com, you'll have the option to log in up here on the top right. And what you'll notice, first of all, is that there's a couple of different versions of InfluxDB. At the very top here, you've got login to InfluxDB Cloud 2.0, which is the latest version of InfluxDB. However, it has not yet, as of this recording, hit a production release. Instead, the current kind of production release version is actually the 1.x branch of the InfluxDB product. Now, that being said, the InfluxDB version 2.0 does have a lot of benefits. There are less components or fewer components that you need to worry about deploying, and it actually has a built-in web management interface for it, whereas with InfluxDB version 1, you'd actually have to deploy a separate component in order to get a lot of the visual functionality out of the product. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and just choose log into InfluxDB Cloud version 2.0. And what this is basically a software as a service or a cloud managed service so that you don't have to worry about running any infrastructure. You don't have to create a virtual machine. You don't have to download and install or configure any software or expose any ports. This is literally just running as a managed service on Google Cloud infrastructure, as you can tell from the URL here in the browser. Now, let's start to familiarize ourselves with the interface a little bit. Now, when you first log in here, the first thing you'll be presented with is the Getting Started section, which basically guides you through the step-by-step process of loading data into the InfluxDB engine, because of course, InfluxDB isn't really useful until we actually have some data that's been gathered and stored inside of it. And then once you have some useful data, then you can start to build interesting graphs and embed those on a dashboard. So you can create dashboards and then store those as bookmarks in your web browser and then easily refer back to them in the future so that you can monitor your application. And then finally, the third step here of the onboarding experience for InfluxDB is to set up alerting. So with setting up alerting, you basically define a metric threshold, and once that threshold is breached, it will trigger an alert for you, and you can integrate with other third-party software. So if we head over to the sources section here and take a look at buckets, if you remember from the previous video, buckets are the most fundamental concept for storing data inside of InfluxDB. You can kind of think of it like partitioning data. So what you'll want to do is come in and create a bucket similar to what I've already done here, where I've created a bucket called Solar, where I used to store Solar metrics. And if you're wondering why I say used to, it's because I've actually moved to using the open source version of InfluxDB that I can run locally on my network and store the data there instead of in the managed cloud service. Now, another nice section here, which we'll dig more into in a future video, is the Telegraph section, where you can create a Telegraph agent configuration to ingest metrics, and it'll generate that configuration for you so that you don't have to write it by hand. And then finally, if you are going to be using an API like the Python API or the JavaScript API to write metrics into the InfluxDB engine using your own application code, then you can come over here and generate tokens that allow you to write data into the engine. Over here, we've got the Data Explorer, where you can build one-off graphs based on the data that's stored inside of your buckets. You can open up a bucket, and then if I drill into maybe the past 7 days, you can see that I now have my measurements as well as the different fields here. So I can go ahead and just graph these fields, and you can see the nice graph here. You can customize those graphs, give them custom colors. You can change the y-axis domain values. So if you know that this is going to be like 0 to 100, or maybe 0 to 1 in this case because it's a percentage, you can customize the domain there as well with the minimum and maximum settings for those graphs. Now over here, we've got dashboards. And so here you can see I've got a pre-configured dashboard that has a bunch of Solar metrics on it. And so if I extend this back out to 7 days, you can see that I have some data in as well. Now there's a couple of other sections that we're not going to go over right now, but what I want to show you next is how you can actually run the open source version of InfluxDB using a Docker container. So if you head over to Google, and remember that there's two different versions of InfluxDB. There's the 1.x branch and the v2 branch. So I'm going to be using the v2 branch for this CBT Nuggets skill. And if you just Google InfluxDB docs for v2 and head over to the Getting Started, if you scroll down a little ways, there is a guide on how to install the CLI on Mac and Linux. And then down here, to start with InfluxDB open source version, OSS, you can click the Docker tab here. And this is actually going to give you the command that you can use to spin up a Docker container on a server or perhaps on your local developer workstation in order to run the product on your local network. Now, one of the things that you might notice here from the documentation is that the image that's being referenced is actually stored on quay.io, which is another image registry for Docker container images. Normally, you might think that the most common repository out there called the Docker Hub, or sometimes called the Docker Store, would be where that image is stored. And it's true, the 1.x branch of the InfluxDB product is hosted on Docker Hub. However, the v2 is currently available on quay.io. So just make sure that you grab that command from the documentation to make sure that you're pointing to the correct official image instead of some third-party image that maybe somebody else created on the Docker Hub. So then if you don't already have it installed, go ahead and install the Docker Desktop utility. If you don't have Docker Desktop installed and you're not aware of what it is, it's basically just a really easy way to spin up a Docker environment on your Mac or Windows system because Docker doesn't run natively on those two operating systems, the Linux platform. So what you can basically do is deploy Docker Desktop, and if you're on Mac OS, it uses the Xhive hypervisor to spin up a virtual machine running Linux, and it sets up your Docker environment so that you can run the Docker CLI on Mac OS, and it feels kind of native, right? Same thing on Windows. It actually uses Hyper-V, or Windows Subsystem for Linux, on the back end to run a Linux virtual machine, set up your Docker environment, and then when you run Docker from a PowerShell prompt on Windows, it's actually running against that virtualized Linux environment. So once you've got Docker Desktop installed on your system, you should be able to go ahead and run this command. So I'm going to fire up a new Windows terminal session here, which is basically just running PowerShell in here. And if I go ahead and just paste in this command and hit enter, it will download that container image locally to your system and then invoke a new container running InfluxDB. Now you'll notice that by default I'm getting a lot of log output here, and that may not be what you want, so you can run the container in a detached mode instead. So if I hit Control-C to terminate that container, and then come back and do --detach instead, when I hit enter I'm going to get an error because the container name InfluxDB is already in use. So I'm going to change that to InfluxDB2. And of course, now it's complaining that the port is already allocated. So I'm going to remove this container that I originally ran, hit the up arrow a few times, and run the Docker command with the detach parameter. And of course, now it's complaining that there's already another container there, so I need to actually give it a new name. Let's call it InfluxDB3. All right, this is much better now. So now instead of getting the logs spit out from that container, sorry, let me scroll down here. I now just get back in response a container ID that I can use to manage this container. Now, the other thing that I would draw your attention to is the -p parameter here that we grabbed from the documentation, where we're basically exposing TCP port 8086 from our host operating system into that container. So now what we can do is fire up our browser, go to localhost port 8086, and that is going to take us to the first run experience for the InfluxDB engine. So you can go ahead and hit get started and then type a username and password, if I remember this one. And then you'll also need an organization name. And this is just used when you are using the writer API to actually ingest metrics into the platform. So I'll just call this Trevor for now. And then you can also specify the initial bucket name. So let's call this CBT data and hit continue. So now we're all set up, and it's going to pop up and ask me if I want to save my username and password, of course. And I'm just going to hit configure later. And now you'll be taken to a very similar home screen as what you saw when we logged into the SaaS version of the InfluxDB product. So at this point, we've now got the product set up, and our first step, as indicated by the first run experience here, is to simply load some data into the target platform. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.